We're sensitive to when we're not getting new information very quickly. Let's say we're cornered at a party with someone who's making small talk. You got to get out of it quickly. It's an aversive state directing us to get new but interpretable information to make us smarter.
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. My name is Jesse Lawler. I am your host, and this is the 188th episode of this podcast dedicated to the proper care and feeding of your own brain. In this case, talking specifically about the feeding department. We're going to be talking with a scientist who coined the term infovores, as in something that eats information. Carnivores eats meat, herbivores eats plants, and infovores, of course, eats information. That is the theory. And in the main interview, I'm going to be speaking with Dr. Irving Biederman, talking about his work studying how and why the human brain craves information the way it does, even information that sometimes might not be all that useful to us, and yet still we got to have it. We'll be talking about why in the main interview. If you hang around until the very end of the episode, I'm going to tell you about a piece of research that I just loved to learn about, basically giving you a scientific get-out-of-jail-free card if you feel like cussing when something terrible happens to you. It turns out that the act of swearing, profanity, cursing, blaspheming, whatever you want to call it, is actually quite efficacious. We'll be talking about that and the ruthless listener retention gimmick. But for right now, let's kick things off first with This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts, This Week in Neuroscience.
So you might not be familiar with the term social jet lag, and I admit I wasn't, but what that is when you have radically different sleep and wake times on weekends versus weekdays, which typically would mean staying up quite a bit later on Friday and Saturday nights, sleeping in later on Saturday and Sunday mornings, etc., etc. Some people do this, some people don't. We've probably all done it when we were in high school and college, but apparently there's a term for it now. Not only is there a term for it, but people are actually doing research on it, and it turns out that it appears to be bad. Sleep scientists have talked about this before. I think this was sort of the conventional wisdom that probably going to bed at the same time and getting up at the same time is a good choice for your circadian rhythms, maintaining regularity when possible. But according to brand spanking new research that was just announced at the 31st annual meeting of the Associated Professional Sleep Societies, social jet lag is associated with poorer general health, worsened mood, and increased sleepiness and fatigue. These effects were independent of sleep duration, also independent of insomnia symptoms, so merely moving the time around on your alarm clock from one day to the next, or not having an alarm clock at all on some days and having it on others, that appears to be a bad move. Looking at the raw numbers, social jet lag was associated with an 11% increase in the likelihood of heart disease. This study was conducted using data from the Sleep and Health Activity, Diet, Environment, and Socialization study, with the clever acronym SHADES, and that was looking at survey responses from 984 adults between the ages of 22 and 60. Said the study's lead author, Sierra Forbush, this suggests that a regular sleep schedule may be an effective, relatively simple, and inexpensive preventative treatment for heart disease, as well as many other health problems. And purely coincidentally, the senior author on the paper was Dr. Michael A. Grandner, who I actually interviewed about sleep and his findings not too long ago, not related to this study, but coming at you on a Smart Drug Smarts episode in the not terribly distant future.
Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast so smart, we have smart in our title, twice.
Picked up a couple of 5-star reviews on iTunes. Listener Abacakes2540 from the USA said, "It never fails. Smart Drug Smarts answers my personal lingering questions every time I listen to an episode." And listener Daredevil1975, also from the USA, says, "I started listening to your podcast about 2 months ago, and now I always look forward to the next episode. In fact, I go back and listen to past episodes while waiting for the new ones." Well, thank you both very much. Thanks to everybody that's been spreading the word. And thanks to the many of you who have signed up now for the Smart Drug Smarts Water Fast Week, which is just about to start right around the corner. The 10th to the 16th of July this year is official Water Fast Week, so by the time you hear me next week, I will not have eaten in several days. But I'm kind of perversely looking forward to it. It's coming anyway, so I might as well look forward to it, because what's the alternative? One piece of very big news this week. We've got a new sponsor, a new Smart Drug Smarts supplement partnership. It is a new supplement company named Vitamunk. Vita is in vitamin, monk is in Shaolin monk. And Vitamunk is launching right now as we speak in a pretty major way. They've already got over 20 supplements that are up and available right now and plans to add a lot more over the course of the next several months. Not all of which are directly cognitive in nature, but a healthy handful of them are. And I also realized that all of us with brains have bodies as well, and sometimes you might be looking for something that's related to general physiology rather than purely cognitive. But Vitamonk is going to be a great resource for supplements. I'll be talking about them more in the future, but I just wanted to introduce you to them this week and definitely invite you to check them out. If you're looking for alpha GPC, if you're looking for ashwagandha, uridine, they've got a deep product line. It's getting deeper, and they're going to unusual lengths within the supplement industry to really make sure that they've got good sourcing practices, purity checking, and quality control, which is really nice to see and was a big part of the decision to get on board with them. Anyway, more on Vitamonk in the future. And in case you're wondering, no, this does not mean that I've fallen out of love with Axon Labs or anything like that, but it's definitely a good thing to be able to have another company that I can stand behind and recommend that has a deep product line, because there's a lot of supplements out there that people are interested in, and when somebody asks, where can I get X? I hate to shrug my shoulders and give a hopeful but not exactly sure answer, and it's going to be nice to be able to say going forward, have a blanket answer ready. Vitamonk is there as a standing go-to recommendation. There is one super strong recommendation that I'm going to make right now, and then I'll shut up about this, but bear with me for another couple of seconds here. Vitamonk is putting together what we're calling a launch list of people to notify as they release new products, and this is going to be happening a bunch over the next 6 months or so as they continue to expand the product line. This launch list is an email list to let people know as they release these new products, and people are going to get the option to buy them at first release at ridiculously steep discounts. The reason that they're doing this is not like a steep discount like 20% off. This is 50% off, 70% off. The kind of deals that would make no economic sense to do, except that the goal in this case isn't to make money on these sales, but just to show sales velocity to Amazon. They'll be selling these products on Amazon as well as on their own website, and by showing a lot of sales velocity early, they can get Amazon to push their products to the broader Amazon buyer community. Those will be normal full price sales and will make giving away the product at no profit whatsoever to the launch list make sense. So long story short, Smart Drug Smarts listeners will get to benefit because we're helping Vitamonk to generate sales from the Amazon buyers, which is a pretty sweet deal for all involved. I should put the caveat that not all Vitamonk products are going to be relevant to you. They're going to have natural hemorrhoidal ointments and things like that, and you can completely ignore those. But then there's going to be things like Bacopa Moneri or Pregnenolone, and you're going to be like, hey, I want that one. And by being on this list, you're going to have the ability to stock up on those things when they're released at prices that you'll probably never really see again. So Vitamonk launch list, really no downside. Delete the emails if you don't like them, but if you do, keep your eye on them, and occasionally you might see an amazing deal that you want. You can sign up for that at smartdrugsmarts.com/launch.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So I'm about to be speaking with Dr. Irving Biederman, who is a professor of neuroscience at the University of Southern California, as well as director of the Image Understanding Laboratory. His favored research topics include shape and object recognition, scene perception, face recognition, and the main meat of the coming interview, perceptual and cognitive pleasure, which you could also kind of state as the joy of learning or the biological mechanisms that fuel our curiosity. Probably a dozen or more episodes ago, we had a This Week in Neuroscience about a study involving the Groundlings comedy team in Los Angeles and how professional comics were held up against amateur comics to study creativity. That particular study is one that you'll hear about again in the coming interview. Dr. Biederman was at the heart of that research, and that's sort of what led to the conversation that you're about to hear. His research into creativity, curiosity, and the actual nuts and bolts work at the neuronal level that gives rise to that. So hopefully that whets the appetite of all of you infovores out there. Here we go now with Dr. Irving Biederman.
The major interest I have is how we get mind from brain. And the interest started with a very simple problem available to anyone who looks out at the world, is if you look at a new scene, how are you able in a fraction of a second to understand what it is? So I used to do these experiments way back when I was at Buffalo, experiments in quotation marks, where if I'd be driving in a new neighborhood and I'd be going down a street I hadn't been to before, as I was turning, I closed my eyes for a moment, first determining that there was nothing right in my path.
We're 2 minutes into the interview and already we have to put in the first safety disclaimer.
Right. Leave this to professionals. And then I blinked at the scene and I realized I was in this fraction of a second. In a blink, I was able to comprehend the whole scene. Of course, not the details. One couldn't remember all the details, but there was absolutely no question of comprehending the scene, what it was like. I could answer probably 50, 100 questions about the scene. Now, there's a safer way to do this experiment in the comfort of your own home on the sofa when you channel surf. So if you change channels and you get to a new channel, just blink, have the sound off so there are no auditory hints as to what it is that you're looking at. And you'll be able to comprehend what that scene is. And if it's one that you've seen before, you'll know it. If it's some commercial or some rerun of some program that you've seen before, a movie, you'll know that too. So to me, initially, the question was, how is it that we get this essentially random photons to our retina? It's an input that's never been experienced previously, and that the brain could make sense out of that input. And we do it immediately and automatically. We can't turn it off. It's impossible to look at the world or an object and not understand what it is. And if it's a novel scene or a novel object, some, let's say, abstract sculpture that we've never encountered before, we know that too. That is, of the near infinity of images we've had previously, we know that this isn't one we've experienced previously. So to me, that was one of the great problems in science. And the particular aspect of that was intriguing at the time, this is some years ago, was shape. Of course, you get color and texture and movement when you're looking at the world, but the great input into visual cognition, how we think, comes from shape, which we could get from a simple line drawing of the image or object. Now, in doing that research, I came across this amazing result that just floored me when I learned about it, was the way we understand shape in a fraction of a second is through a series of stages in the cortex. So as many of your listeners will likely know, an image is first projected onto the retina and then gets transmitted very quickly in about 20, 30 milliseconds to the cortex, to the occipital cortex, where we get some representation of that image. We don't have understanding yet, but we essentially get the world into our head. And the visual system is extraordinarily efficient at doing that. Actually, it's as efficient as you could possibly get in terms of requiring the fewest number of cells. But that's a story for another time. So once it's in the brain, it's in the cortex, there are then a series of stages, about 4 or 5, by which that image, which is essentially what we'd have with a camera cannot understand what the image is that's projected onto its sensory surface. But in a series of 4 or 5 stages, we achieve understanding. And each of those stages takes about 10 milliseconds, one synapse per stage. And we're understanding, that is, we've activated our high-level interpretation of what that scene is. And so we've studied that problem. We've developed, we think, the first general theory of shape, or biological theory of shape, using primitive simple shapes that we call geons. But I guess the topic for today is based on another discovery in that pathway, which is there's a gradient of opioid receptors. So if we start with the V1, which is the first cortical visual area in the back of the occipital cortex, which initially receives the information from the eyes, a way station called lateral geniculate body in the thalamus, then in that pathway, in a series of, let's say, 4 or 5 stages, we have in V1, the first stage, a very sparse density of these opioid receptors. And as we go forward toward the anterior temporal lobes, toward the front of the brain, we get a greater and greater density of these opioid receptors until in what's called associative cortex, where we have all our world now, things that we've learned over the world, and we already have the benefits of what's called perceptual organization, that those areas are chock full of opioid receptors. The question that intrigued me was, what are they doing there? Why? We think of often perception as one of those boring topics that everyone thinks, oh, it occurs so quickly and easily, it must be a simple explanation, when in fact over half the brain is dedicated to it. But nonetheless, the question is, why would we have these happy chemicals, endogenous chemicals, these opioids, in this pathway dedicated to vision? And from that, we've developed the theory of perceptual and cognitive pleasure, which controls what we will spontaneously look at or think about. And this can go on to account for an enormous range of human behaviors that had previously not been well studied, such as humor or creativity.
Yeah, and also things like beauty, things that everybody has an intuitive understanding of, but is difficult to quantify.
Well, actually, beauty very likely will give us more opioid activation. But the aesthetics, so this theory becomes a theory of aesthetics, essentially about what we do enjoy looking at. Let's say you went into a new room that you've never been to before. The window on the right was a brick wall. The window on the left, there was this fantastic vista of the shoreline with people there and, whales and dolphins and boats. We'd, of course, look at the window that gave us a view. And indeed, rooms with a view cost more. Here in Southern California, it'd be $10 million if you could get a view of the shoreline, if not more. People will pay for that, of course. And one of the things that prisoners complain about the most is that in their cells is they don't have a view, that they'd like to be able to far focus, look out upon the world. And many prison cells don't allow you to do that. And it's one of the most distasteful things or aversive things that prisoners complain about, even animals. So if you put a monkey in an enclosed box, it will work very, very hard so that a window in the box will open up and he'll be able to have a 10-second peek into the lab to see what other people are doing and so on. That is, monkey will want that same view to the world rather than being in an enclosed space. And indeed, in thinking about it, we're not surprised about that. This is indicating that same drive for information. And indeed, we've coined this term called infovores, that this system makes us infovores, always looking for new and richly interpretable experiences. And so we could get this, again, by having new experiences or something that has a lot going on, like that view of the shoreline. Or you can think of any scene that you prefer looking at. Let's say we love sitting at a Paris cafe with a view of the sidewalk where we see people walking by and so on, where we could see this dynamic life. And why would we pay $20 for a cup of coffee for that experience? Well, it's worth it. We're feeding our inner infovore. We're getting information about the world. Curiously, just to pick up on a point that you mentioned, so let me backtrack a bit. There's an ambiguity in our use of the term aesthetics. It can often be used for something that's pretty, like a rose or a pretty face or some nice layout. But there's another aspect of aesthetics, and one could think of a photography exhibition where it's not so much pretty, but it's interesting.
Right.
And engaging. You want to know more about it. So you see a picture of a rose. Okay, it's pretty. I've seen thousands of roses. It doesn't really get me. I understand. I'd rather have that than some disgusting image, but it doesn't occupy me much. An image that I like to use in the demonstration talks that I give was taken in 1904 at the Gare de l'Ouest in Paris. And it shows this locomotive from what would be maybe the third floor has burst through the facade of the station and is hanging down at like almost a 90-degree angle.
Yeah, it's a great photo. I know the one you're talking about.
And it's in black and white. And we wouldn't call it pretty, but boy, we'd rather look at that than the rose. It's engaging. We want to know what happened. Look at this. And so many questions are raised by it. So the theory I'm describing as it relates to aesthetics is that aspect of aesthetics rather than prettiness.
Here's one question, maybe backtracking a bit. You mentioned that half the brain is devoted to perception, which that's an amazing statistic, I guess, just because, humans have such large brains compared to most of the animal kingdom. And yet lots of the animal kingdom has eyes, has noses, and basically the same sensory apparatus, and presumably they operate in the world physically as well as we do. So we have to expect that their senses are kind of on par with ours, but they're doing it with a much smaller brain. I mean, how can we sort of reconcile that weirdness?
That's an excellent question. The vast tracts of the brain dedicated to vision are giving us this rich interpretation of the world. So the monkey, which does have a large proportion of its cortex also dedicated orientated to vision. Differs from us in that first part of vision, getting a clear image and its sensitivity to, let's say, the orientation of a line or the size of a line or some stimulus is indistinguishable from human data. That is, it would be hard to know from very simple tasks whether one is looking at a monkey or a human, other than the fact that the monkey has faster reaction times because they have shorter axons. But the monkey, as almost all other animals, for the most part lives in the here and now. It sees a piece of fruit, an attractive female, and that's it. For us, for humans, so much of our understanding of the world is not something that occurs in the immediacy of the scene. It's what we bring to it in terms of our prior learning and understanding. And that's where we have these gigantic areas in the anterior temporal lobes that give us a whole world about what we've learned about the world and the interpretation. So when we look at a scene, we bring so much to bear about what it means. And that's how we differ from so many other animals. So that's the part that is loaded with these opioid receptors, that they guide us into coming up with these interpretations. And there's an aspect of that that relates to a characteristic of what we prefer looking at, where I said we want a rich interpretation. What would be awful is to be locked into a room with no features, like a prison cell. Let's say sometimes we're at the doctor's office and we're called into the examination room. We forget to grab a magazine and we're there waiting for the doctor, but we're reduced to counting the holes in the acoustical tile in the ceiling just to keep the system engaged. Because when it's not engaged, we're feeling boredom. Preference is for new experiences. Having seen the movie, read the book, had the conversation, it's been there, done that, I want something else. We're sensitive to when we're not getting new information very quickly. So let's say we're cornered at a party with someone who's making small talk. You got to get out of it quickly. So it's an aversive state, not feeding this natural opioid system. But of course, that's a healthy system. It's directing us to get new but interpretable information to make us smarter.
Right. It's all in the service of learning, even if we're not sure it's going to be useful.
Right. And there are two aspects of this I might mention. One is, how do we get this sensitivity to new information versus something we've experienced before? And second, why would this system have evolved in the first place? There has to be some evolutionary advantage for this system. And it turns out having this system gives us an advantage in both senses of Darwinian adaptation. Let's say you need an axe quickly, and you happen to notice a few days earlier where it was in the cave, and now you could get it quickly. It's something you noticed, remembered, and you stored that information. Being an infovore gives us a natural advantage in terms of natural adaptation in the Darwinian sense. But curiously, it also gives us a sexual advantage. There is an elaborate study by David Buss at the University of Texas, who examined 38 different cultures, from those in modern developed countries like Western Europe and the US to cultures that would be just this side of the Stone Age, very hunter-gatherer tribal cultures. And he asked this very simple question: what do you desire in a potential mate? One thing that in every culture, both males and females, specified they wanted someone who would be intelligent. So intelligence is taken as a positive trait in potential mates all over the world. The question is, how do we know who's intelligent or not? We don't have our IQs tattooed on our forehead. Aiko Shimojo, a social psychologist associated with Caltech University, did a study of exactly that, though it's limited to East Asian countries and the U.S. She asked both males and females, how do you judge whether someone is intelligent? And there were a number of things that differed amongst cultures, like whether someone has a good sense of humor or whether they make decisions quickly. So in some cultures that was positive, in others it was negative. But what was universally positive trait was having lots of information. And this system for being an infovore, it gets us lots of information that will make us more attractive in sexual selection. Let me just, if I can, knock one other nail in this story about what is it, what's the mechanism, the underlying mechanism leading us to new experiences rather than old experiences. Because classical reinforcement theory said that, if we enjoyed the movie, we should go back and get it again, or we enjoyed the book or had the conversation, we got reinforced, we liked it. And it's decidedly not the case, it becomes aversive. Well, it turns out the cells in these anterior temporal areas, the areas that are richly immersed in these opioid-releasing neurons or opioid receptors, show adaptation. That is, if you repeat a stimulus, and you could show this in fMRI in human behavior or with recordings of individual neurons in the monkey, if you repeat a stimulus, you get less activity the second time and less the third and so on. There's a strong response to novelty and then a diminished response as that stimulus is repeated.
If you had a really good microscope, you could see the little neurons yawning.
Exactly. So it turns out that this is likely reflecting a critical mechanism of a brain. Why would it do that? Why would it reduce its firing? We normally think of learning, we should get more firing. We're learning this experience better, but we see less. So how does that come about then? So what actually happens is this is the theory, and there's a fair degree of evidence for this, when a new stimulus is shown, let's say you have a person in the MRI scanner and he's looking at scenes and you repeat a scene or some stimulus, the first time you get a lot of activity. But what happens then is the neurons that were most activated by that stimulus, by that experience, inhibit those neurons that were only weakly or moderately activated by that experience. So as you repeat stimuli, only a few neurons winds up coding that experience, and they've inhibited the others that were initially or not as strongly activated by that experience.
Those neurons sort of become like the designated expert pathway for that stimulus in the future.
Exactly. And don't feel sorry for the inhibited neurons. They are now freed up to code something else. So this becomes the brain's own exquisite way to divvy up its resources so it never runs out of synapses.
And do we see parallel behaviors in other areas of the brain with different types of learning? Like if for muscular movement, like let's say that you're a bowler and you're trying to get down your perfect bowling move. Do we see the same sort of inhibition of neurons in the same region that are sort of close but no cigar as you get your perfect move down?
That's a good question, and likely yes. So there's a subcortical structure called the striatum, and let's say you play the piano, and there's a sequence of notes that you might play, or when you're learning to type, let's say you have some name that has an unusual spelling pattern. Now, initially, what happens if you have that sequence, there are cells that are called associative cells in the striatum that code those sequences. So they are activated when you're learning a new sequence. But at some point, you'll get that automatically. There's a shift in the neurons from these perceptual motor neurons to what are called sensory motor neurons in the striatum. This process, this phenomena by which strongly activated neurons for a given stimulus or given input or experience inhibit weakly or moderately activated neurons has been called neural Darwinism. The strongest win out over the less activated, the weaker. So what we're seeing in this shift in the striatum essentially may be doing that, and it would be also a mechanism designed to give you a shift from something that you're learning afresh to something that becomes automatic and you don't have to think about. So you may have fewer neurons actually coding that experience. Humans, and likely monkeys too, have a built-in system for face recognition. We see there are parts of the brain that are more or less dedicated for individuating faces, so we're able to distinguish one face from another. So if you're walking in the jungle 30,000 years ago and you think there may be a face peeking out from this dense foliage, those people who said to themselves, it's nothing, just a pattern of leaves, their genes are no longer with us.
Right. That's one thing I think is so fascinating, that evolution has put us on a hair trigger for recognizing what might be other agents, other entities that can do things to us. And it's better to be wrong and sort of have your tripwire tripped more often than it is to be wrong in the other direction.
Exactly. I mean, there's another turn that this research has taken us based on this discovery. So at the back of the New Yorker magazine, the last page, they have a contest every week. And it's one of their staff, a cartoonist, draws a picture, and it's published without a caption. And the contest is for people to come up with a caption. And if you look at that, you get these brilliant responses. But in any event, this work on perceptual and cognitive pleasure very reasonably led to humor, which hadn't been well studied. And our interpretation of this, which is also the same interpretation that we have for creativity, is that a humorous response as well as a creative response links distant association. So if we ask someone how much is 5 and 3 and he says 8, we don't think of that as a creative response. So creativity has been a difficult study. In our judgment, humor is a great test bed for studying creativity. If you ask someone to come up with a creative music selection or poetry, it's difficult to know, is it really creative or is it just something different? The criteria are ambiguous. But in humor, you have a clear criterion as to whether the response is creative or not. Does it make you laugh? So we've been studying both the experience of humor when you look at a cartoon and then see the caption and it just makes you laugh. Where are the areas in the brain that are being activated by a funny caption versus one that would be more mundane or simply describing the picture but not really linking the incongruous element to something else that gives an interpretation? So the point about why it would be funny, our perspective, is that a funny caption links distant associations. And in doing that, it has a long way to travel, which will lead, if it's successful, to lots of opioid release. And it's the same feeling we have when we're creative. So the kindergarten teacher who has her charges doing finger painting and holds them up as being creative, well, there's no criterion for that. They're novel, but they're not creative. A creative solution has to be both novel and solve some problem. So we've been studying that actually, both in terms of humorous response and humor creativity. I don't know if you're familiar with the Groundlings.
Yeah. They're sort of like the farm team for Saturday Night Live out of Los Angeles.
Right. So these people, we given them these like cartoon-like drawings that they haven't seen before. While they're in the magnet, their brains are being scanned, and they have to come up with a funny response. So what we're finding is that humor in general, when you appreciate it, is activating these opioid-rich areas in the anterior temporal lobes. And the creativity part is we run these professionals and we run some who are merely novices. They're just starting out and they're not as good as the professionals, like the people in the Groundlings. What we see is the amateurs, or let's say novices, show a lot of prefrontal cortex activation, the kind that's associated with deliberate search. They see this cartoon, this drawing without a caption, and they have to come up in the magnet with something funny, and they're searching for something. The professionals, they show very little prefrontal cortex activation. They're not deliberately searching. They show activation in the anterior temporal lobes. What they're doing is reaping the fruits of their spontaneous associations, remote associations. They're not searching. They're just laying back and letting it happen.
That leads to a question that I wanted to ask, which is, what do we see about the activation of mu opioid receptors when we are introspecting on something? Like I can look out in the world and see photons coming into my retina, or I can also close my eyes and visualize the face of somebody I know well, or visualize a vista or whatever. Do we see similar levels of activity when people are introspecting on sensory detail?
That's a good question. Now, one thing with using imagery is you're generating the imagery from things that you already know. So there's less novelty there. So let's say you ask people to imagine an elephant wearing a wristwatch with an expandable band on its left front foot. Okay? Mm-hmm. What we see when you're doing something like that, it's not clear it goes all the way back to V1, but certainly in areas V2, V4, and these areas called the lateral occipital complex, where we do a lot of the visual heavy lifting in terms of shape, that we see activity there when you're imagining things. So let's say you're imagining something big, like an elephant. It takes you more time to image the watch than if you imagine the watch is around a mouse, where it's something small. The watch around mouse's waist will be at the same scale as the mouse, so it will be readily perceptible. But around the elephant, it's just a teeny part. And so you have to zoom in to get it. And people have done research like that about the scale of things in our imagination. That's something we're quite adept at, and it's not necessarily something that will give us a differential response in terms of this opioid system.
It's interesting. In the last couple of years, meditation has been so much in the news, all the positive science coming out about the various benefits. But in a lot of ways, the things you're studying show just why it's so difficult for people, because really you're trying to squeeze all the novelty out of your brain, out of your thinking.
I can't meditate. It's like being in prison. frankly, I don't see what the benefits are. So I could see in some cases people who are stressed out a lot, that it may be relaxing to them. But all this mindfulness, I fail to see the benefits or clear evidence. And your life is so much more interesting than making your mind go blank. I don't get it. It's not something that in our evolutionary history, if the guys just sat around the cave and meditated, they'd starve to death or the lion would eat them or something. I get great joy, and I think many people do, from an active probing and dedication of their mind to problems rather than sitting there and letting their mind go blank. So some people I know think it's a valuable experience. Okay, there are differences of opinion. I'll let them do their meditation well. I'll do my science.
I feel like we need to schedule a future episode that could be a neuroscientist cage match between you and a meditation advocate. Looking at your studies as a whole, what are some ways that people could take information about the pleasure gradient of novel information, the joy that we can get from gathering up information, even though it might not necessarily be useful later? What are some of the real-world takeaways or prescriptive tips to take advantage of the fact that we are Infowars?
I think we're naturally prone to do that, which is why when we're prevented from doing it, like in prison, or sometimes, at least when I went to elementary school, you'd have these mindless exercises where you just have to do rote repetition of something to learn something. And again, many of us found that aversive. So I think we're all Infowars to a different extent. But what engages us will vary greatly. And there are other motives. So I should say something about this motive. It's a default system. If we're searching for a car in a parking lot, or we're looking for our keys in the morning, or looking for a restaurant in a given street, then we turn off. We're not so much interested in getting opioid hits. We're interested in solving those tasks. And if you're not doing something else, then you want to get new and interpretable information. So we have this yin-yang, this motivation to be doing things we have to do, which meet our goals in life. We have to eat, we have to avoid threats, and so on and so forth. And then we suppress this desire for new and interpretable information. So one thing that I've found interesting is that Karl Marx said that religion is the opioid of the masses. I think he was right at the time, and certainly right for a segment of the population. But I think for much of the population, what has substituted for religion is celebrity. People are just entranced by celebrity. Look at all these magazines, most popular ones, People and so on. You go to the supermarket checkout counter and you see all these magazines, and they're dedicated to celebrity. Or that website, what's Daily Mail, it's loaded with celebrities. People are just tuned into that. Some of that you could understand from an evolutionary sense. It's in your interest to know what the powerful people in your tribe are doing and thinking. Though when we get involved in the minutiae of it, it's of course crowding out other things, though it gives you a social bonding experience. So all your friends would know what these celebrities, their popular celebrities, are doing. And so that's become their opioid needs when they learn something new about what the celebrity is doing, who's breaking up with whom. So we get that information. A problem with it, it doesn't go very far. You get these current opioid hits that will keep you engaged. It's interesting to read People magazine, but at the end of the day, what do you do with that? People have an advantage who are not so entranced, let's say, with celebrity. And typically brighter people are not. And some of that is they'll understand things that less bright people have difficulty understanding.
I'm finding myself nodding as you're saying this, but you're living dangerously saying this in Los Angeles.
Though I have great admiration for the people who do the entertainment industry. Those people who make movies know a lot. USC, of course, very famed film school. I'm not so much talking about them as about people who are obsessed with the products of that industry, not the people who know how to do lighting on a film, good directors, film editors. These people are clearly masterful. So it's not them. It's people who are just consuming this, often of celebrities who it's not clear what you're getting from them. So the Kardashians, you may know all about them. It's not quite clear what you've gained from that.
Yeah, it's not useful information. Your point is a great one, though. In the old days, 50,000 years ago, when the celebrity was whoever the top dog in your tribe was, it made a lot of sense to know the minutiae about his or her interests because you would be interacting with that person, at least peripherally, and it would directly affect your life. But yeah, that no longer holds.
it's interesting that we have this response. So you want to show loyalty to the powerful people in your tribe and support them, that they're going to be fighting with the next tribe. And in my view, that's what fuels fandom for teams. So it's very interesting to see the Rams, after 19 years or something like that, return to Los Angeles the year before last. And right away, there were these people who were painting their faces blue, wearing Rams stuff. And you just wonder, there's no direct gain from that. If anything, the profit centers for the teams are going to charge lots of money to buy tickets and all this gear that people wear. And again, it may be, again, a Darwinian motive that this is your tribe and you want to support it. It's not that the PR departments of these teams are so efficient. I think that they could engage people like that, get them to care so much about the teams. But what they're doing is exploiting a pre-existing motive or drive we have to be supportive, to be involved with our own tribe.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So a big thank you to Dr. Irving Biederman for taking the time for that interview. I think that is a fascinating framework to look at humans and presumably other animals too, our appreciation for novelty and learning. How we have the system to mine for the potentially valuable trivia that might never come in handy, but then again it might. Not all of this made it into the final interview, but he's also done really interesting work looking at how the appreciation for novelty is somewhat relaxed in children as compared to adults, as in children are eager to hear the same damn bedtime story 10 nights in a row if it's one that they haven't quite fully processed yet. They're not quite ready to move on to random trivia acquisition the way that adults are. For them, it's more important to lay the neural pathways for the basics, even if that makes dealing with children sometimes incredibly tedious for adults. It's nice to have a cognitive theory that at least explains why that is the way it is. Also, really interesting to hear that half the human brain is devoted to visual processing. That is a fact I was definitely not aware of. It makes you think about blind people or people that lose their sight and become blind and the changes that can cause in the brain. 50% of the brain's real estate up for grabs for brain plasticity remapping. You can see why that's got major consequences. We've actually got a sensory remapping episode planned for later this year. Still getting that one together, but a topic that I'm really excited about. But immediately next, let's switch to the ruthless listener retention gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts, ruthless listener retention gimmick.
So there is something sort of heartwarming about looking at things that are universal all across human cultures, every culture known, looking under the hood at what drives these behaviors and seeing that there's actually something to it, that these things that are universal are kind of good ideas for some reason having to do with basic effectiveness. And there are a few things that are more universal than cussing when something doesn't go your way. It shows a certain lack of self-control and is generally frowned upon. And yet, damn if it doesn't feel good and you don't want to do it when something goes horribly wrong. And a New Zealand researcher named Michael Phillip at Massey University decided that he would look at this relatively universal human behavior of cussing under duress, particularly when it's something psychologically bad that's happened, not necessarily something like stubbing your toe, but being told that the tickets you were going to buy just doubled in price, or remembering that you left the carton of ice cream out on the counter and it's going to be melted by the time you get home. Situations that he called short-term social distress. So there's something called the pain overlap theory, which basically posits that physical and social or emotional pain are processed the same way within the brain. And previous studies have shown that pharmaceutical interventions such as paracetamol can be effective in alleviating both physical and social pain, which kind of gives credence to this theory. But Dr. Phillip wanted to see if swearing aloud might have some of the same benefits, if it might really be as effective at the self-management of pain as it seems intuitively like it might be. So he took 70 participants and he broke them into two groups, then he tested them to see how sensitive they seemed to be to both social pain and physical pain. They were asked to write about a social event where they felt excluded and their feelings were hurt. This was supposed to rouse the corresponding emotions in the person, and then they were randomly assigned to either swear aloud or to say a non-swear word aloud. The results suggest that socially distressed participants who swore out loud experienced less social pain than those who did not. Previous research suggests that social stressors like rejection or ostracism not only feel painful, but also increase people's sensitivity to physical pain. Pain overlap theory predicts that anything affecting physical pain should have similar effects on social pain, says Dr. Phillip. And also falling into alignment with the theory, the people who swore out loud experienced less sensitivity to physical pain. Despite the fact that this sounds like good news to those of us who are sometimes inclined to talk like sailors, Dr. Phillip warns that swearing every day or in only mildly irritating situations might weaken the pain-softening power of profanity when you really need it. So try to bellow profanity only on an as-needed basis. There is still speculation about why swearing aloud has the effect that it does on physical pain and social pain. What's clear is that swearing is not a completely maladaptive reaction to a sore thumb or a broken heart. Finally, he stresses that while swearing might be an emotional band-aid, it is not an emotional ER unit, and that for people that are suffering extreme emotional pain from grief, abuse, or other trauma, professional or clinical care might be needed. That in those cases, yelling an unending stream of profanity will probably not have good results.
We like to think of ourselves as a digital speakeasy for brain hackers, but you can call us Smart Drug Smarts.
Okay, so you heard it. That was all for episode number 188. Thank you for hanging around until the very end. If you enjoyed this episode, you will find everything that we talked about here up online at smartdrugsmarts.com/188. If you missed last week's episode, I was speaking with Dr. Gerald Pollack about the fourth phase of water, structured water as it is also known. I'm thinking a lot of watery thoughts as I'm just a couple of days from starting my water fast for 2017. It's not too late, although it's almost too late to jump aboard that if you want to join the group. Sign-ups for that are at smartdrugsmarts.com/waterfast. And if you're not so much into voluntary starvation, but you are into physical health and are looking to build out your supplements cabinet, then I direct you over to Vitamunk.com. Or if you want to get on board that launch list, I explain it in detail at smartdrugsmarts.com/launch. Next week in episode number 189, I'm going to be talking about performance under pressure, how the brain performs best and controls the body best in high-pressure situations, talking with a guy who could best be described as a brain coach for groups ranging from professional sports teams to military special forces groups. So tune back in for that next Friday. I will be back at you then, same time, same podcast, and with that same unflagging commitment to helping you fine-tune the performance of your own brain. Have a great week in the meantime, and of course, stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast.
Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only, although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.